America in the 1930s was a land of contrasts. On the streets of New York, the unemployed stood in long lines for soup, while in the skies above Seattle, the future was already being born. The Great Depression had brought industry to its knees, yet it was during these difficult years that one of the most ambitious ideas of the 20th century emerged: to create an aircraft capable of carrying war thousands of kilometers from home, rising above the clouds and returning safely, even when it seemed impossible. It all began with a challenge issued by the U.S. Army Air Corps. In 1934, the military decided it was time to replace its outdated bombers, which resembled creaky flying buses. The new aircraft had to fly at a speed of at least 320 km/h, carry up to a ton of bombs, and cover a distance of over 3,000 kilometers. At the time, this sounded like science fiction. 3 companies accepted the challenge: Douglas, Martin, and Boeing. The first 2 were favorites, successful, with stable contracts and strong government ties. Boeing, on the other hand, was teetering on the edge of survival. The company had just lost a major order, and its funds were evaporating faster than the paint on its hangar walls. But it is in such conditions that legends are born. Chief Engineer Arthur Raymond and his team understood. If they didn't create something truly extraordinary, Boeing would disappear. In Seattle, long night meetings began. Arguments lasted until dawn, and sketches were literally drawn on napkins and newspaper margins. From this mix of desperation and inspiration, Project Model 299 was born. Raymond once said, "If we are to lose, let us lose with an aircraft that is decades ahead of its time." And the engineers took this challenge as a personal vow. Model 299 looked like a visitor from the future. A fully metal body, 4 engines instead of the usual 2, an enclosed cockpit, positions for gunners, and a bomb sight. But most importantly, its philosophy. This aircraft was not meant to be just a machine. It was meant to be a fortress. When the prototype rolled out of the hangar in Seattle in the summer of 1935, journalists were stunned. One of them, a reporter from the Seattle Times, whispered, "This is not an airplane. This is a flying fortress." And thus, the name that would change history was born: Flying Fortress. The aircraft was armed with machine guns mounted in all directions. It seemed capable of firing in virtually any direction, defending itself like a knight clad in steel, with guns instead of armor. Military observers at McCord Field shook their heads skeptically. Too complex, too heavy, too expensive. But when the machine took to the sky, doubts vanished. Pilot Eddie Allen took the controls. The 4 engines roared, and the air filled with the vibration of power. Model 299 rose smoothly, confidently, as if born to fly. It flew faster and higher than even its creators had expected. The first tests were a resounding success. The aircraft broke all distance and speed records for bombers in its class. Army officials began whispering about a revolution in aviation. It seemed Boeing had not only pulled itself out of crisis, but had also transformed the entire American military doctrine. But fate had its first blow in store. Just one day before the contract was to be signed, disaster struck. During a demonstration flight, Model 299 crashed. The pilot had forgotten to remove the elevator locks, and the aircraft failed to gain altitude. It crashed on takeoff, claiming the lives of 2 crew members. The press instantly shifted from praise to pessimism. Headlines screamed, "Flying Fortress crashes." Yet even in this tragedy, there was something symbolic. From the ashes of that accident, Boeing emerged with a new understanding. To build a fortress, one needs more than metal. one needs a system. The Army still ordered several test units. And although the contract formally went to Douglas, destiny had already chosen its path. Model 299 received a new designation, B-17, and from that moment, the story began of the aircraft that would forever change the nature of war in the skies. Autumn 1935. Wright Field Air Base, Ohio. Tension hung in the air. Senior officers of the U.S. Army Air Corps had gathered to witness which bomber would become the face of future wars. The Douglas DB-1, Martin 146, and Boeing Model 299. 3 competitors, 3 dreams, 3 different visions of what aerial power should look like. Boeing appeared to be the front-runner. It was faster, flew higher, and could carry more bombs than any of its rivals. In the eyes of the military officers standing by the runway, the sky reflected hope. If this aircraft passed the tests, America would gain an unprecedented advantage. The pilot that day was seasoned Major Plouffe, and the navigator was the legendary test pilot Leslie Towers. They had already flown the Model 299 dozens of times, but on this day, fate decided to test not only the fortress in the sky, but the hearts of its creators. As the aircraft taxied onto the runway, everything seemed perfect. The engines hummed like a well-tuned orchestra. The dense metal fuselage gleamed in the sunlight, and the air was thick with the feeling of the future. The takeoff began. Speed, 100, 150, 180 kilometers per hour. Suddenly, a strange deceleration. The aircraft barely lifted its nose, wavered, and as if drained of strength, crashed into the ground. Flames engulfed the fuselage. Engineers, officers, journalists, all rushed to the crash site. Firefighters tried to break through the heat, but it was too late. Leslie Towers was killed. A few days later, Plouffe succumbed to his injuries. What was meant to be Boeing's triumph turned into tragedy. Newspapers wrote of the end of a dream. The military immediately suspended the contract. Competitors celebrated. But Boeing's engineers did not give up. Arthur Raymond and his team conducted a meticulous investigation. It turned out the cause of the crash wasn't the design, the engines, or the aerodynamics. The pilot had simply forgotten to remove the elevator locks. A human error, but a fatal one. It was then that Boeing invented something that would later transform not only aviation, but the entire concept of flight safety, the pilot checklist. A paper sheet with items to be completed before takeoff. Fuel, flaps, locks, controls. A simple idea born from tragedy. Today, every pilot in the world uses this system. Defeat became the source of revolution. The Army could not ignore the power of Boeing's machine. Despite losing the contract, the company received a small consolation order, just 13 units for testing. It seemed like a drop in the ocean, but from those 13 aircraft grew an entire generation of bombers that would soon be called Flying Cities of Death. Over the following years, Boeing engineers refined the design, reinforced the armor, reshaped the wings, increased the number of machine guns, and improved radio communication. Each new version was a step forward, from the YB-17 to the B-17B. Regular test flights began across American skies. The aircraft flew at altitudes of 10,000 meters, where the air was thin as ice. Pilots complained of cold, frozen cockpits and vibrations, but each time they landed, they admitted, "We've never seen anything like this. It's as if the plane is alive." Meanwhile, a storm was brewing in Europe. Germany was rising from the ashes of its World War I defeat. Posters featured a man with a mustache and a fanatical gaze, Adolf Hitler. His engineers were building the Stuka, Messerschmitt, Heinkel, and no one doubted anymore. a new war was only a matter of time. Americans watched from across the ocean, but understood. When the thunder strikes, they would need to respond swiftly, precisely, from afar. And then they remembered the B-17. It was during these years that a new concept was born: strategic bombing. The idea was not merely to support ground troops, but to destroy the enemy's infrastructure, factories, bridges, railways. And for that, they needed an aircraft capable of reaching the target, unleashing its payload, and returning, despite fire, cold, and distance. The B-17 was the perfect candidate. When war erupted in Europe, the Americans already had a concept and a machine ready to bring it to life. But the United States remained on the sidelines, for now. Boeing continued producing B-17s for the draw, as if knowing that soon the Fortress would be needed by the world. And that moment came on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The Pacific Ocean, Oahu Island. The morning began peacefully. Blue skies, palm trees, sunshine, and lazy seagulls drifting above the bay. American sailors sipped coffee, unaware that within minutes the sky would collapse upon them. At Pearl Harbor, preparations were underway to receive a shipment of the newest aircraft, the B-17 Flying Fortress. Several planes were en route from the mainland to Hawaii, continuing on to the Philippines. The pilots carried not weapons, but fuel and hope. At that time, America still did not consider itself a nation at war. Then the sky began to roar. Hundreds of dots appeared on the horizon. At first, they were mistaken for friendly aircraft. After all, the arrival of the B-17s was expected. But within seconds, the silence was shattered by the shrieks of diving Zeros, and the sky over Pearl Harbor turned into a storm of steel and fire. The Japanese Air Force attacked with such precision, it seemed as though fate itself was guiding their controls. When the first explosions thundered over the battleships Arizona and Oklahoma, the approaching American pilots had no idea what was happening. Their aircraft were unarmed. They had no ammunition, no defense, only empty skies and terror beneath their wings. One of the pilots, Robert H. Richardson, later wrote, "We thought it was a drill. Then we saw the explosions. Then people jumping into the sea. That's when we understood the war had already begun and we were in it, whether we wanted to be or not." Several B-17s managed to land under fire. One touched down on a vacant lot, another on a highway, and one more on a bomb-riddled runway. Despite the chaos, most of the aircraft survived. This became the first trial of the Fortress, and it passed. Pearl Harbor became a symbol of defeat, but it was on this day that America awoke. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan. 3 days later, on Germany. The world had plunged fully into fire. The war demanded not just revenge from the United States, but a systematic technological response. That response came in the form of the Flying Fortresses. Within months, Boeing received orders to accelerate B-17 production tenfold. Factories in Seattle and Wichita operated non-stop. On the assembly lines stood not only men, but women. The future Rosie the Riveters, symbols of a new industrial army. Hundreds, then thousands of fortresses took to the skies. Each aircraft was assembled like a work of art. Control levers were checked by hand, fuselage seams inspected under spotlights. Names began to appear on the sides of the new planes: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, Ye Old Pub. Each bomber became not just a machine, but a personality. The B-17 was not built for defense. It was built for retribution. It could fly at altitudes unreachable by anti-aircraft guns and strike targets far beyond the front lines. But most importantly, it could return. Stories of fortresses returning with shredded wings, missing engines, and scorched cockpits became legends. One such aircraft, hit more than 600 times, still managed to reach base. When it was photographed, engineers couldn't believe it. It shouldn't have been able to fly, but it still flew. Thus was born the reputation of the B-17, the plane that doesn't die. Meanwhile, the strategy of war was changing. Europe groaned under the blows of the Luftwaffe, and Britain, having endured the Battle of Britain, stood as the lone island of resistance. It was from there that a new phase began, retaliatory raids on Germany, and at the center of these strikes were the American B-17s. Flying fortresses formed massive squadrons that rose into the sky like silver flocks. Their route led to the very heart of the Reich, Berlin. Where once Hitler's legions had marched, now thundered a rain of steel. But first, they had to get there. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, awaited them in the skies like hawks circling their prey. Every mission was a gamble with death. Every bomber carried not just bombs, but belief that surviving this day meant contributing a small part to ending the war. Thus began a new era, the era of strategic aviation, where wars were won not only by tanks and soldiers, but by machines flying above the clouds. 1942. Britain, Bassingbourn Airfield. The morning smelled of kerosene, wet grass, and fear. Along the concrete runways stood rows of new machines, shiny, massive, with white stars on their wings. Their engines rumbled low and deep, as if each fortress breathed in unison with the others. These aircraft were not just machines, they were symbols of resolve. America, still recovering from the blow of Pearl Harbor, was preparing to repay its debt, not out of hatred, but from the conviction that evil must not go unanswered. Thus began the campaign of strategic bombing against Germany. The targets, factories, ports, railway junctions, fuel depots, cities, everything that fed the war machine of the Third Reich. The plan seemed insane: to fly hundreds of kilometers deep into enemy territory, without escort, without fighter cover, which simply couldn't make the distance. Only the sky, the enemy, and their own courage. The B-17s were the first to go. They took off in massive formations, dozens of aircraft in each group. From the ground, it looked like a silver cloud rising toward the sun. Reflected light dazzled the eyes. It seemed the sky itself was shining with metal. The journey was long. Inside the fuselage, the engines roared, gunners kept their hands on the machine guns, and pilots listened intently to every word from the radio operator. Outside, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees. Oxygen masks froze, and crews often lost consciousness. But no one complained. No one wanted to be the first to say, "I'm afraid." As they approached their targets, the sky turned into a nightmare. Hundreds of black clouds, the bursts of German anti-aircraft shells. Between them darted Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, diving straight into the formations of fortresses. It seemed impossible to pass through and survive. But that was when the B-17 showed why it had been built. Its armor absorbed the blows, its guns repelled the attacks, and its pilots, even when losing control, managed to guide the aircraft to its target. The bombers dropped their payloads and turned back, sometimes burning, sometimes with shredded wings, but still returning. And among them was one that the whole world would come to know, the Memphis Belle. This aircraft became a legend not because it was the best, but because it survived. The crew, under the command of Captain Robert Morgan, completed 25 combat missions, a symbolic number, after which the crew was allowed to return home. No other B-17 had achieved that at the time. Every mission flown by the Bell was on the edge, through clouds of fire and steel. Once, a bomb exploded directly beneath them, flipping the aircraft upside down. Another time, a shell pierced the tail section and lodged in the floor, but didn't detonate. When the Memphis Belle landed in England after its 25th mission, hundreds of people stood on the airfield. Some cried, some applauded, and some simply watched in silence, understanding that this was not just an airplane. It was proof that even in hell, one can survive if they believe in the sky. Photos of the Belle spread across America. Its image became iconic, and the aircraft itself, the star of a documentary filmed right on the front lines. And although the war continued, from that moment on, people began to believe that victory was possible. The B-17 had proven strategic aviation was not a theory. It was a real force, capable of paralyzing the enemy's industry. But success came at a price. 1 in 3 crews did not return. Each mission meant dozens of young faces disappearing into the smoke over Europe. And yet, despite the fear, the cold, and the losses, new crews climbed into their fortresses and flew again. Because now, the war depended on them. With each passing month, the sky filled with more silver. Boeing's factories worked around the clock. At one of them, a sign appeared. Every rivet, every bolt, is a chance that someone will come home. The B-17 became more than a weapon. It became a bridge between courage and science, a symbol of how engineering can become a form of bravery. But a new challenge lay ahead. While the fortresses were pounding German factories, their successor appeared on the horizon, the B-24 Liberator. And soon after, a giant that would redefine the very nature of aerial warfare. But before the B-29 soared over Japan, the B-17 had already written its name into eternity. Winter 1943. Europe was drowning in grey smoke. And it wasn't fog, it was the breath of war. Beneath this sky, where day and night were no longer distinguishable, began one of the most grand and terrifying campaigns in aviation history, the air war over Germany. American B-17 flying fortresses and British Lancasters were no longer just bombing targets. They were creating a strategic hurricane, methodically tearing out the enemy's heart. Factories, oil refineries, railway junctions, workshops, everything that fed the Third Reich was to vanish under a hail of bombs. But the road to Berlin was not just a path. It was a trail through hell. In early 1943, the Americans launched Operation Point Blank, a series of raids on Germany's industrial centers. The primary goal, to paralyze the Luftwaffe's aircraft production and destroy its infrastructure. But reaching those targets meant flying hundreds of kilometers under the crosshairs of Germany's best aces. The B-17s flew in formation like a living organism. Lead groups flew in front, flank protection on the sides, and defensive positions at the rear. Every gunner knew, if you drift out of formation, you become easy prey. Hundreds of machine guns thundered in sync, creating a wall of metal above the clouds. German pilots called it flying hell. One of them, Günther Rahl, recalled, "When you entered a B-17 formation, it felt like every inch of the sky was shooting at you. It was a sky that killed." August 17, 1943. Operation Schweinfurt-Regensburg. Two massive waves of B-17s lifted off from airfields in Britain. Their mission? To destroy ball-bearing factories and aircraft plants, without which German planes could not fly. The flight lasted nearly 8 hours. At first, everything went according to plan. But over Germany, they were met not by clouds, but by thousands of tracer rounds. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had. Attacks came in waves from the front and below, as if the sky itself had turned into the jaws of a monster. B-17s lost engines, caught fire, but kept flying. Those unable to stay in formation were consumed by flames. Half of the aircraft did not return, but the rest reached their targets, dropped their bombs, and against all odds made it home. One surviving pilot said, "I saw the sky turn black, not from smoke, but from the shadows of planes that are no longer there." Winter 1944. The target, Berlin. No city was defended more fiercely. German radar detected the fortresses hundreds of kilometers away, and the sky was thick with anti-aircraft batteries. Every mission there was nearly suicidal. But the order was clear. Berlin must feel that the war had reached it. When the first waves of B-17s crossed the Reich's border, the Luftwaffe launched everything that could fly. Hundreds of fighters attacked from all directions. The battle lasted for hours. The air trembled from explosions. The sky glowed with tracers. Some B-17s returned with holes the size of doors. Others landed missing one, or even two, engines. There were cases where a plane flew with its tail completely destroyed, sustained only by the monstrous resilience of its design and the willpower of its pilot. American engineers later said, "The B-17 didn't fly on fuel, it flew on the stubbornness of its crews." At high altitudes, the cold was unbearable. Inside the aircraft, temperatures dropped below 50 degrees. Metal cracked from frost. Oxygen masks froze over. Hands stuck to machine gun grips. Yet the crews kept working, for hours, under the roar of engines and the creaking of the fuselage. Each flight, 8 to 10 hours of fear and anticipation. Every meter of the journey, a step along the edge of a knife. Pilots knew, if you survived today, tomorrow you would fly again. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. By the end of 1944, Germany was suffocating. The bombings had destroyed major factories, disrupted fuel supplies, and annihilated railway junctions. Tank and aircraft production plummeted, and the Luftwaffe could no longer recover its losses. American and British fortresses flew almost without resistance. The air war was won. But the cost was monstrous. Over 47,000 B-17 crew members were killed. Each of them knew that their seat at the controls was a one-way ticket. And yet they flew. By spring 1945, over the ruins of Berlin, there were no more German fighters. Only the sound of propellers, the hum of hundreds of flying fortresses, and a quiet realization. This war in the sky was over, but its lessons would remain forever. The B-17 became not just a weapon. It became a symbol of resolve, engineering brilliance, and human endurance. Spring 1945. The war was coming to an end. Berlin was burning. The Reich was falling apart at the seams. And on the airfields of England stood rows of weary B-17s, dulled, scarred, with patched-up fuselages and windows taped over. Their engines fell silent one by one, like the hearts of soldiers finally returning home. Their mission was complete. But the story of these machines was only beginning. When the first news of Germany's surrender spread across the world, the pilots of the flying fortresses didn't celebrate loudly. They simply sat beside their aircraft, in silence. Some stroked the metal skin, Others quietly removed the nose art, where bright paint bore names like Heavenly Days, Miss America, Memphis Belle. Every plane had a soul. Each was a home, a comrade, and a witness to hundreds of deaths. And yet, they began to be decommissioned. The war was over, which meant the army no longer needed thousands of flying fortresses. Some B-17s were scrapped. Others were repurposed for rescue and transport missions. But for their crews, these aircraft remained part of their hearts, something impossible to say goodbye to. In 1943, the U.S. Air Force decided the nation needed inspiration. They chose one aircraft, Memphis Belle, which had completed 25 combat missions and returned home intact. Its crew became a symbol of courage and endurance. After the war, the Belle was shown across America. Crowds greeted the pilots, threw flowers, children reached out to touch the fuselage as if it were sacred. Newspapers wrote, "It flew through hell and came back alive." Later, this aircraft inspired films, books, and paintings. It became not just a machine, but a legend that helped people understand the cost of victory. After the war, many B-17s were converted for civilian use. They carried passengers, mail, and medical supplies. Some took part in scientific expeditions, delivered equipment to polar stations, fought wildfires, and monitored weather. And yet, wherever they flew, they were always viewed with reverence. For post-war pilots, these machines were not just old metal. They were reminders of a time when every minute in the air could cost a life. Decades passed. New aircraft became faster, higher, more advanced. The jet age arrived, and the B-17s seemed like relics of the past. But time could not erase their sound. When an old fortress rises into the sky at an air show somewhere in America, the crowd falls silent. The propellers begin to spin. The air fills with a low hum, and for a moment it feels like 1943 again. The wind carries the scent of oil and kerosene. The sun glints off the rivets, and from the loudspeakers comes the voice of the announcer, "Flying Fortress, the legend that never fell." People applaud, some cry, and old veterans stand tall, struggling to hold back trembling hands. For them, it's not just an airplane. It's a memory, cooled only on the outside. Sometimes history remembers not only those who fought, but those who gave them wings. The creators of the B-17, engineers at Boeing, were not on the front lines. But their work was no less heroic. When they designed the Fortress, few believed such a bulky machine could fly. 4 engines, a metal body, guns on all sides. It seemed like madness. But Donald Douglas and his team knew the future belonged to machines that could defend themselves and their crews. And they were right. The B-17 didn't just fly, it changed the very concept of strategic aviation. Today, only about 40 flying fortresses remain in the world. Fewer than 10 are still airworthy. Every time one of them takes off, it's an event. People travel from other countries just to hear its roar, to see it lift off. Heavy, but proud. These machines have become flying museums, messengers from the past. Their flight is not a show. It's a reminder. Freedom is never free, and sometimes steel and courage sound the same. The symbol of the B-17 lives on not because it was powerful, but because it became human. It witnessed fear and bravery, pain and hope. It outlived those who flew it, but remained for them a permanent home in the sky. And now, when an old engine starts up in the quiet of an airfield, and the Fortress slowly rolls down the runway, it feels as if it whispers, "I remember. I'm still flying." After the war, the world finally exhaled. But that breath was heavy, as if the wounded lungs of humanity were trying to remember how to breathe peace instead of smoke. And yet, in this new air, where sirens had fallen silent and engines no longer roared, a familiar echo still rang, the low, unmistakable hum of 4 engines, the hum of the B-17, a machine that did not vanish with the war, but became its living reminder. While Europe struggled to rebuild its cities and America to restore itself, engineers and military minds realized that everything they had learned while building the Flying Fortress had laid the foundation for a new era, not just of aviation, but of technologies that would hold the world in balance. And if someone had said back then that the legacy of the B-17 would help create aircraft capable of crossing oceans without stopping, no one would have believed it. But that's exactly what happened. The B-17 was more than just an airplane. It was a school. From its design, from the experience of combat missions and countless reports, emerged ideas that formed the basis of the B-29 Superfortress, then the B-52 Stratofortress, and later the modern giants like the Boeing 747. Every new aircraft carried something of that original fortress, a sense of weight balance, calculations of stability, and the understanding that even the heaviest machine can fly if it's built with heart. Years later, Boeing engineers admitted, when they were designing the first jetliners, old B-17 blueprints still hung in the workshops. Not as instructions, but as reminders of where belief in the impossible had begun. The world gradually forgot the sound of sirens, but not the sound of propellers. At air shows around the globe, the fortresses became the main stars. They were restored, repainted, returned to flight. And every time a heavy machine with World War II emblems rose under an old sky, people lifted their heads. Elderly men in Allied uniforms stood still. Women wiped away tears. Children asked, "Is it real? Did it fight?" And the answer was always the same. Yes, and it survived. Because the Flying Fortress became a living symbol of survival, not just of the aircraft, but of the human spirit. Monuments to the B-17 appeared in dozens of cities. Some stand on pedestals, others in museums, and a few still fly. One of them, Sally B, still takes to the skies over England, participating in memorial flights. Its engine hums gently, like an old voice saying, "We were there. We did it. We came back." People watching from below don't just see an airplane. They see the face of an era, when engineering was an act of faith, and steel was the embodiment of courage. Historians often say the B-17 didn't win the war. And that's true. The war was won by millions, on land, at sea, and in the air. But the B-17 did something greater. It taught people to believe that the sky could be conquered. Every mission flown by these machines was a step from chaos to control, from despair to hope. When the first fortresses lifted off from British airfields, the world trembled. When the last ones landed in the spring of 1945, the world already knew it could survive. More than 80 years have passed. Today, somewhere in the American sky, an old B-17 rolls onto the runway again. The sun dances on its metal wings. The air vibrates with the roar of its engines. It lifts off heavily, gains altitude, and the shadows of the past seem to come alive once more. On board, not soldiers, just people, descendants of those who once fought, those who want to hear how history sounds when it's not written in ink, but in metal and wind. The aircraft disappears into the clouds, and on the ground someone whispers, "Listen, do you hear it? That's history flying." And maybe that is true immortality, not in books, not in museums, but in sound, in flight, in that moment when the sky remembers. After the war, there was no family in America untouched by aviation. Some had lost sons in the skies over Germany, some had built airplanes, and others had simply stood on the ground, gazing into the clouds, trying to imagine where their loved ones might now be flying. And when the dust of war finally settled, what remained in people was not only pain, but a longing for the sky. A world that had endured destruction began to look upward, not with fear, but with hope. The sky no longer seemed a place of death. It became a symbol of freedom, and in this new belief, the Flying Fortress once again led the way. The B-17 inspired an entire generation of young engineers and pilots. Boys who had built wooden model airplanes during the war now dreamed of designing their own. They enrolled in universities, joined flight schools, created their first aircraft models and jet engines. Newspapers wrote about the generation of wings. Young people raised under the hum of engines. Many of them said, "We want to fly because our fathers flew fortresses." From this dream, a new American aviation was born. B-17 pilots became the first instructors of civilian aviators. Those who had fought now taught others how to fly, not for victory, but for life. From former Boeing military engineers came the designers who built jetliners and made the sky accessible to everyone. It can be said that every passenger plane flying over the ocean today is a descendant of the B-17. In its contours, in its strength, in its navigation systems, lives the memory of that machine that once returned home with bullet-riddled wings, but never fell. Meanwhile, in film and art, the Flying Fortress became a symbol of courage and unity. Movies, books, and documentaries portrayed not just the aircraft, but the people, the crew, where the mechanic, gunner, pilot, and radio operator were one family. From these stories emerged the image of the Dream Team, where each person was responsible for the other. Young people, inspired by these tales, reached not only for the sky, but for the idea that great things are achieved not alone, but shoulder to shoulder. Thus, the Fortress became not just an airplane, but a symbol of the American dream of flying together. Then came the festivals of the sky, the first air shows, where old B-17s rose into the air alongside jet aircraft, became national events. Veterans who had remained silent for decades suddenly began to speak, not about death, but about life, about sharing the last cup of coffee before a mission, about laughing at fear, about listening to music through radio headsets to drown out the roar of the wind. And in their voices was not sorrow, but quiet strength. That strength was passed on to the young. Today, American flight academies uphold a tradition. Before their first flight, every cadet walks through a memorial hall where a photograph of the Flying Fortress hangs. Beneath it, a caption reads, "Those who flew before you made the sky safe. Now it's your turn to protect it." These are not just words. They are a promise passed through generations. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the Fortress is not in metal, not in textbooks, but in people. Descendants of pilots, mechanics, and engineers still gather at annual reunions, where the sounds of old songs bring back memories of their heroes. And among the conversations, someone always says, "When I see a B-17, I feel like my father is beside me again." These words are simple, but within them lies the entire meaning of why flying fortresses were built. They were not made for war. They were made to come home. And when another fortress climbs into the sky, drawing eyes upward, one can notice a strange detail. Even the most modern aircraft seemed to fall silent beside it. Because the sky still remembers who came first, who taught humanity not to fall, even when the weight was unbearable.